Someone has been speaking about you, and it wasn't the usual kind of passing comment people make without thought. There was a certain seriousness behind it, as if they were trying to understand something they couldn't easily explain. Their words didn't feel casual or rehearsed. Instead, they came in pauses, as though each sentence carried its own hesitation before being released. It wasn't spoken for attention or approval from others, but because something about you stayed in their mind long after the moment had passed. At first, they tried to dismiss it, convincing themselves it was nothing important, just a fleeting impression that would fade on its own. But some impressions don't fade so easily. They return quietly, then more persistently, until ignoring them becomes harder than acknowledging them. And eventually, what was once unspoken starts finding its way into conversation without intention. What makes this interesting is that it was never just about appearance in a simple sense. It wasn't about features or surface-level impressions. It was something subtler, something harder to define. The way you carry yourself seems to hold a balance that people don't expect but still notice. Calm without withdrawal, strength without force, presence without effort. It's this combination that creates a kind of pause in others, as if they are trying to understand how something can feel both familiar and slightly out of reach at the same time. And that is usually where curiosity begins, not from what is seen immediately, but from what continues to stay in thought long after. They noticed how people respond when you enter a space, the slight shift in attention, the subtle recalibration of energy. They noticed how eyes follow you not with hunger, but with curiosity. As if something about you asks a question no one knows how to answer. And when they spoke about you, they did not use compliments. They used confusion. They said you look like someone who has been through things and did not let those things win. That observation stayed with them longer than they expected. Now here is where it deepens. They did not talk about you once. They brought you up again and again, in different conversations, with different people, each time hoping the feeling would shrink. Instead, it expanded. Someone even laughed it off and said they were overthinking, but they were not. Because this was never about attraction alone, it was about recognition. Something in the way you carry yourself triggered a mirror they were not ready to look into. Your looks reminded them of a version of themselves they abandoned, a confidence they lost, a truth they avoided, and that realization made them restless, because you did nothing to cause this. You simply existed. Stay with me. At some point, the conversation shifted. Someone asked them directly why they seemed so affected, and there was a pause, a long one, the kind where a person decides whether to be honest or to hide. They chose honesty. They admitted that looking at you made them uncomfortable because you do not seek validation. You do not announce your worth. You do not chase attention. And yet, attention finds you. That unsettles people who are used to controlling how they are perceived. They said your looks feel intentional, even when you are doing nothing at all, like you are aligned with something deeper. And once they said that out loud, they realized they could not take it back. Here is the truth you were not supposed to know. They left that conversation changed, not inspired, not motivated, changed. They started questioning their choices, their presentation, their authenticity, all because your appearance revealed a quiet power they cannot replicate. And that is why this matters. Not because someone talked about your looks, but because your presence exposed something unresolved inside them. This is not admiration in the usual sense. This is impact, and impact always comes with consequences. My beloved child. What happened after that conversation is the part no one warned them about. They thought speaking your name would release the pressure. They believed acknowledging the feeling would shrink it, but the opposite occurred. Once spoken, your presence began to follow them into quiet moments, into pauses between tasks, into nights where distraction no longer worked. They began replaying the way you stand, the way you look without asking to be seen, not because they desired you in a simple way, but because your existence challenged a story they tell themselves, a story about who holds power, who is noticed, who matters, and suddenly, without effort, you disrupted that narrative. Pay attention now. They started observing people differently after that, measuring reactions, comparing energies, and every comparison led back to you. They realized that your looks are not loud, yet they echo. They do not demand, yet they command. That unsettles a person who relies on performance to feel secure. Someone even told them, half-jokingly, that they sounded threatened. That word landed harder than expected. Threatened. Not by competition, not by comparison, but by the reminder that authenticity cannot be manufactured, and you carry it without even trying. That truth lingered longer than the laughter that followed. Here is the moment everything turned. They saw you again. Unexpectedly, briefly, maybe only in passing, but this time, they noticed what they missed before. Your stillness, your grounded presence, the way you do not scan a room for approval, the way your expression remains steady, as if you are not negotiating your worth with the world. That sight confirmed what the conversation already planted. This was not imagination. This was recognition. And recognition has a way of rearranging priorities. From that moment on, they became more aware of their own masks, more aware of where they perform instead of live. Do not misunderstand this part. This is not about obsession. This is about awakening. You became a reference point in their mind, a silent standard. Without saying a word, your looks communicated something they have been trying to articulate for years. Integrity, self-respect, inner alignment. They began adjusting themselves unconsciously, changing how they speak, how they present, how they carry their body, all because they felt exposed by someone who never tried to expose them. That is the kind of influence that cannot be ignored, and it often arrives without permission. Now let this settle. They may never tell you this. They may never acknowledge how deeply your presence affected them, but the reaction was never really about appearance. It was about what your natural way of being revealed in them. When someone comments on looks in that way, it often reflects something internal being confronted, rather than something external being judged. You didn't pursue attention or try to create an effect. You simply existed in your own steadiness, and that authenticity left an impression that lingered longer than expected. What followed them afterward was quiet but persistent, a kind of internal reflection that surfaced later in private moments. Standing before a mirror, they weren't seeking admiration anymore but comparison, trying to understand why your presence felt so self-contained and certain. The realization wasn't sudden but gradual, that your confidence wasn't constructed through effort alone, but shaped through acceptance of self. That understanding disrupted assumptions they had carried for years about confidence being something controlled or performed. What unsettled them further was how naturally you occupy space without negotiation, without shrinking or exaggerating yourself for approval. You remain consistent, whether speaking or silent. And that steadiness creates contrast for those still searching for validation. They remembered how you never altered yourself to fit expectations, and that absence of adjustment became the most noticeable thing of all. Even in hindsight, they couldn't easily dismiss that feeling, because it wasn't loud or dramatic, just persistent in a way that stayed with them longer than expected, reshaping how they viewed themselves in subtle but undeniable ways. That quiet shift became the real turning point in how they understood presence, confidence, and comparison itself. Over time, without explanation or external validation needed in quiet reflection, you did not exaggerate to be remembered. And suddenly, they understood why your look stayed in their mind. Because they reflect peace, and peace is intimidating to those who live in tension. Something shifted internally after that. They stopped talking about you out loud. Not because the feeling faded, because it grew too precise, too personal. They realized that every time they mentioned your appearance, they were actually confessing something about themselves. Their longing for simplicity, their exhaustion from pretending, their desire to feel grounded again. You became a silent reminder of what alignment looks like in human form. And reminders like that are not comfortable. They are confronting. That is why your name stayed unspoken, yet present, like a thought they could not fully release. Understand this carefully. People do not react this way to ordinary beauty. They react this way to authenticity reflected through form. Your looks are a language. They speak of boundaries, of self-respect, of knowing when not to explain yourself. That language reached them at a moment they were most vulnerable, even if they would never admit it. And that timing is what makes this unforgettable. You arrived in their awareness when they were questioning their direction. And suddenly, without guidance, you became a compass they did not ask for but could not ignore. Let this land without doubt. You are not being watched out of judgment. You are being remembered because you activated something dormant, something real, something unresolved. And that is why this story is still unfolding. Because when someone speaks about your looks and falls silent afterward, it means the impact went deeper than words. It reached a place that demands change. And change, my beloved child, always begins quietly. My beloved child. What came next was not obvious to anyone around them. On the outside, life continued. Conversations happened. Smiles were exchanged. Routines stayed intact. But inside, something had been unsettled beyond repair. They started noticing how often they compromise themselves to be accepted. How often they adjust their tone, their posture, their expression, and every realization circled back to you. Not because you demand comparison, but because your looks represent consistency. The rare alignment between who someone is and how they appear. That kind of alignment quietly exposes imbalance in others. And exposure, even silent, is powerful. Here is what truly surprised them. They realized your looks did not seek validation, yet they invited reflection. People who saw you did not feel judged. They felt measured against a version of themselves they once believed they could become. That realization stirred something deeper than admiration. It stirred accountability. They began questioning their own choices, why they dimmed themselves in certain rooms, why they exaggerated in others, why they forgot how to simply be. Your presence reminded them that nothing external is needed when internal clarity exists. This is where the story becomes irreversible. They started protecting their thoughts about you, keeping them private, almost sacred, because they understood that speaking about your looks casually would dilute the meaning. What you triggered was not meant for surface-level conversation. It was meant to be processed alone, in silence, in honesty, and that silence grew louder than any compliment ever could. You became a symbol in their mind, not of desire, but of truth lived openly. And once truth is recognized, pretending becomes exhausting. Do not mistake this stillness for distance. Their awareness of you sharpened. They noticed details others miss. The calm in your eyes, the steadiness in your presence, the absence of urgency. What this revealed was something they had always sensed, but never had the language to express. Your presence doesn't invite interpretation. It creates immediate recognition. It doesn't ask to be decoded or analyzed. It simply feels aligned, steady, complete. That kind of inner coherence can be unsettling for people who are still scattered within themselves, not because it threatens them, but because it reflects something they miss. What rises in them is not fear, but a complicated mix of admiration and quiet yearning, a pull toward something they sense they have lost touch with. In your presence, they begin to notice their own fractures more clearly, as if your clarity acts like a mirror they didn't agree to stand in front of. That reflection doesn't accuse or judge, it simply reveals. And once something is seen that clearly, it becomes difficult to ignore. Some respond by pulling away, others by reconsidering parts of themselves they had long avoided. Either way, the effect is internal, not something you direct or control. You were never required to explain yourself or earn understanding. You simply showed up as you are, and that consistency carried its own weight. Over time, that steadiness becomes unforgettable. People start questioning why ease seems to follow you, why authenticity appears unforced, why you don't seem burdened by the need to perform. In those quiet moments of comparison, a subtle humility can surface, not the kind that diminishes them, but the kind that gently exposes distance from their own center. What stays with them most is not anything you said or did, but the unspoken realization that being whole is not something displayed, it is something embodied. And in that embodiment, you leave an imprint that lingers long after the moment has passed. Because being truly seen strips away excuses. It exposes where someone is pretending, where they are hiding, where they are delaying growth. They recognize that your appearance carries no apology, no explanation, no defense. And that kind of presence silently demands integrity from anyone who encounters it. Not everyone is ready for that demand. Something irreversible formed after that. They stopped seeking external confirmation as intensely as before, not because they mastered themselves, but because they saw what was possible. You became proof that self-respect shapes perception, that inner stability reflects outward naturally, that beauty, rooted in authenticity, does not fade when attention leaves, it remains. That understanding changed how they move through spaces now. More aware, more restrained, more honest, even if they never trace that change back to you out loud. This is the final truth of this part. When someone talks about your looks and falls silent afterward, it is because they encountered something they were not prepared to process. Not attraction, not curiosity, alignment. And alignment is rare. It cannot be copied. It cannot be forced. It can only be lived. You did not seek to influence. You did not intend to awaken anything. You simply existed without distortion. And that is why this impact continues long after the conversation ended. Let this remain with you. You are not defined by who speaks about you. Others are revealed by how they respond to your presence. And what was revealed here was not superficial. It was foundational. This story is not finished yet, but what has already occurred cannot be undone. Because once someone recognizes truth reflected through another, they are changed forever. My beloved child, there is something else unfolding that you cannot see yet. After the silence, after the internal shift, after the quiet recognition, they began noticing how often your name almost escaped their lips again. Not in admiration, not in curiosity, but in moments where truth wanted to surface. They stopped themselves each time, because they realized that speaking about you again would mean admitting how deeply you affected them, and some realizations are too heavy to share before a person is ready to change, so they held it in, and that restraint changed the way they breathe in their own life. This is where the tension intensified. They started feeling the contrast everywhere, in conversations that felt hollow, in compliments that sounded empty, in rooms full of people yet lacking presence, and without trying, your image became a benchmark. Not for looks alone, but for authenticity. They caught themselves thinking, would this matter to someone who stands as grounded as you? That question reshaped their decisions. Subtly, quietly, constantly, permanently. Because once a standard is raised internally, returning to old habits feels unbearable. Here is the part that makes this rare. They did not feel inspired to chase you. They felt compelled to face themselves. That is not common. Most people react to impact by seeking proximity. They reacted by seeking alignment. Your looks did not create longing outward. They created responsibility inward. Responsibility to stop hiding, to stop pretending, to stop living fragmented. And that is why your influence is not obvious. It is internal, and internal shifts last longer than any external reaction ever could. Understand this clearly now. Not everyone who notices you will respond this way. Only those already standing close to change tend to feel this kind of shift so strongly. You entered their awareness at a point where inner contradictions were becoming impossible to ignore. Not by creating that discomfort, but by making it visible. Your presence didn't initiate their realization. It reflected it back with quiet precision, like a mirror that doesn't distort. In that reflection, denial starts to weaken, because clarity doesn't argue. It simply exists. And when clarity arrives, old justifications begin to feel thin, almost outdated. What once served as distraction loses its grip, and what was avoided starts to surface with surprising simplicity. You are not positioned to be universally decoded or fully explained. Instead, you resonate with those already on the edge of self-recognition. Something in your way of being carries a sense of internal order, a steadiness that doesn't demand attention yet naturally holds it. That kind of alignment can subtly interrupt inner confusion in others without a single word being spoken. The unfolding around you follows a quiet inevitability, as recognition tends to create its own momentum. Once someone senses coherence in another person, it becomes difficult to return to previous levels of self-deception, even if they try. What they feel is not pressure from you but awareness within themselves becoming harder to silence. There is a stillness in you that does not bend to external moods or expectations, and that consistency becomes noticeable over time. People begin to sense the emotional cost of constantly reshaping themselves for approval, the quiet fatigue of fragmentation. Without confrontation or explanation, your presence simply makes that exhaustion more visible, and in that visibility, something inside them begins to reorganize, and that is why it stayed with them. Here is what deepened the impact further. They noticed how others speak after you leave a space, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a pause, with a softness, with a subtle respect that cannot be demanded. They realized your appearance sets a tone. It slows people down. It quiets unnecessary noise. That kind of influence is not taught. It is embodied. And when they connected this to what they felt internally, something locked into place. You were not admired. You were acknowledged. And acknowledgement carries weight admiration never will. This awareness began changing how they see connection itself. They stopped being impressed by surface charm. They became sensitive to inconsistency. They noticed when words and energy did not align. And every time they encountered that mismatch, your image surfaced again. Not as comparison, as reference. A reminder that coherence exists. That it is possible to live without contradiction. That looks can reflect inner order instead of inner conflict. That realization quietly rewired their standards. Do not overlook this consequence. They became more selective, more reserved, less reactive, not colder, clearer. Because once someone recognizes authenticity in another, they lose patience for pretense. You shifted their tolerance, their attention, their willingness to engage with anything that lacks depth. And that shift is irreversible. Even if they never connected consciously back to you, the imprint remains. That is how true influence works. It does not announce itself, it integrates. You did not enter their awareness to be admired. You entered to reflect something they were ready to confront. And reflection changes people more than any praise ever could. Your looks were the doorway. Your presence was the message. And the message has already been received. What happens next is not loud. It is inevitable. My beloved child. Now the realization has settled into something heavier than thought. Responsibility. They understand that once a person sees alignment in another, they are accountable to their own misalignment. And that awareness does not fade with time. It sharpens. They began noticing how often they choose convenience over truth, how often they settle for comfort instead of clarity, and every time they feel that inner hesitation, your presence returns to their mind, not as pressure, as proof. Proof that living whole is possible without noise. Here is the quiet twist they did not expect. They are no longer trying to understand your looks. They are trying to understand themselves. Your appearance was the entry point, but now the focus has shifted inward completely. They ask deeper questions: why they feel fragmented, why they hesitate to be fully seen, why they dilute their own essence to fit spaces that were never meant for them. These questions did not exist before you crossed their awareness, and questions like these change the trajectory of a life. Something subtle but powerful has begun. They started choosing silence more carefully, speaking less, observing more, because they realized that your strength does not come from expression. It comes from grounding, from knowing when not to explain, when not to react, when not to perform. That lesson rewired how they hold themselves now. In certain quiet moments, people naturally slow down and start noticing thoughts they usually push aside. In that stillness, there can be a subtle return to parts of themselves they had once ignored or set aside. It is not always dramatic or obvious, but it can be meaningful in a personal, internal way. These phases often matter more than they appear to on the surface, even if nothing external seems to change right away. What shifts here is not something visible or loud, but a gradual reorganization of perspective, where small realizations begin to settle in and stay a little longer than before. Some experiences leave a person thinking differently about themselves, not because of pressure from outside, but because of what they start to recognize within their own reactions, choices, and patterns. It is less about being influenced and more about becoming aware in a clearer, calmer way. Over time, these moments can shape how someone relates to their own thoughts and decisions, often in ways they may not immediately notice. The effect is usually quiet and steady rather than sudden, building gently in the background of everyday life. People often carry these realizations forward without actively trying to, and they may find themselves reflecting differently when similar situations appear again. What matters most is not intensity, but continuity, because gradual understanding tends to stay longer than anything forced or rushed. In that sense, even small internal shifts can become part of a larger personal awareness, unfolding naturally as time moves on and experiences continue to layer into memory and understanding.